Ours is an era of tumultuous and violent change. Institutions, conventions, and alliances that have shaped the world for generations are crumbling before our eyes. Regulations and legal protections are being gutted, and prejudices codified into law. Our screens are flooded with images of war, genocide, and mindless AI-generated slop. Perpetual crisis and partisan outrage have become normalized. And it seems like the only thing that everyone can agree on is that everything is getting worse. The US-backed neoliberal order is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Outside the gilded boardrooms and backlit auditorium stages of Davos, few will mourn its passing. For 50 years, this system of capitalist globalization has dispensed vast quantities of misery upon the world, destroying livelihoods, displacing communities, and transforming entire regions into sacrifice zones of rust belts, strip mines, clear cuts, maquiladoras, sweatshops, and export processing terminals. But its collapse is no cause for celebration either, because what's rising to take its place is even more brutal and far more dangerous. Today, we are witnessing a return to the great power politics that defined much of the 19th and first half of the 20th century. But this time with hypersonic cruise missiles, nuclear warheads, and artificial intelligence. At the time of writing, the Persian Gulf is burning. Trapped in the chaos unleashed by Israeli expansionism and American hubris, the region has joined Ukraine, Gaza, and Lebanon as the latest live-fire testing grounds for next-gen autonomous weapon systems. The disastrous US-Israeli war on Iran and the Iranian regime's reprisals against Gulf states' energy and shipping infrastructure will shape the global economy and international security architecture in ways that will reverberate for years to come. These events mark a violent and dramatic escalation to processes that were already well underway. For years, US hegemony has been declining alongside the ascent of the so-called BRIC nations, carving the globe into spheres of influence dominated by regional superpowers. Outside of their orbit, so-called middle powers have waged bloody proxy wars over contested oil and mineral deposits, gas fields, and access to strategic seaports. Every day, billions of dollars of goods flow within and between massive trading blocs like the EU, Mercosur, the USMCA, and the RCEP. This complex web of international supply chains is, in turn, backed by an evolving patchwork of military alliances. NATO, for decades the primary enforcer of the so-called Washington Consensus, is today challenged by new multilateral security partnerships such as AUKUS, the Quad, the CSTO, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Multipolarity, a concept long championed by Cold War reenactors on the left, and ethno-nationalist ideologues like Alexander Dugin and Zhao Tingyan on the right, is now the fundamental reality of international relations. This change hasn't come out of nowhere. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, whose neocon architects hoped would usher in a new American century, instead marks the beginning of American decline. The 2008 financial crisis was a clear warning of what lay ahead, and the COVID-19 pandemic, a major inflection point. But the line was definitively crossed with the 2024 re-election of Donald Trump on a campaign of resistance to the so-called globalist agenda, a red-pilled term for the US-led neoliberal order.
They're coming for you.
Acting on his threat to make America great again, Trump has sought to arrest and reverse the United States' generational decline by renegotiating the terms of its alliance with Europe, making a deal with Russia, and consolidating its dominance over the Western Hemisphere. Even before taking office, Trump was openly fantasizing about annexing Canada and Greenland and dispatching the US military to seize the Panama Canal. By soft launching these ideas, Trump was sharing an early blueprint for a North American superstate, a so-called Greater America. And while corporate media outlets have consistently failed to take these plans seriously, investors, politicians, and military planners have not. The Canadian state has reportedly begun running military simulations in preparation for a possible US invasion, modeling the use of asymmetrical guerrilla tactics, such as those used by the Taliban in their insurgency against US and NATO troops in Afghanistan, while at the same time seizing on the resulting surge in Canadian nationalism to gut environmental regulations and fast-track a long list of ecocidal mega-projects under the banner of national security. This includes a resurrection of the PRGT pipeline, planned through unceded Gitxsan and Gitignan territories in so-called BC, and the rebranded Plan Nord, or Northern Action Plan, for the Innu-inhabited territories of so-called Quebec. Meanwhile, in the territories ruled by the Mexican state, Claudia Sheinbaum continues to pursue Morena's so-called Fourth Transformation, a grand nationalist vision anchored by mega-projects like the Mayan Train and the Interoceanic Corridor, which seek to spur increased tourism, industrial development, and resource extraction, while displacing indigenous peoples from their lands and further militarizing the country's southern border with Guatemala. This militarization serves as a safeguard for capitalist investment, but also as a mechanism for curbing migration, which also advances Donald Trump's agenda. Building on a centerpiece of his first term, Trump has shamelessly fanned the flames of white nationalist reaction, seizing on racist anxieties of a so-called immigrant invasion to initiate a state of exception, assume wartime powers, and unilaterally impose conditions on governments in Latin America and the Caribbean. Here, he has found his most willing accomplice in Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, who has eagerly transformed his country into an offshore concentration camp, offering to warehouse deportees and even US dissidents in his country's notorious terrorism confinement center, better known as CICOT. It was Bukele, along with his Argentinian and Ecuadorian counterparts, Javier Milei and Daniel Noboa, who first sold Trump on his so-called Shield of the Americas initiative, a new military and intelligence-sharing alliance ostensibly aimed at fighting terrorism and cartels, but transparently aimed at containing Brazil, a rising regional power, and the United States' chief hemispheric competitor. Within this context, Trump is reportedly considering designating 2 Brazilian criminal gangs as terrorist organizations, and recently negotiated a state of forces agreement with Paraguay, paving the way for an increased US military presence on Brazil's doorstep. Amidst a massive naval deployment dubbed Operation Southern Spear The Trump administration launched a dramatic special forces raid on January 3rd, capturing Venezuela's corrupt, autocratic president, Nicolás Maduro, and replacing him with the country's corrupt, autocratic vice president and Minister of Petroleum, Delcy Rodriguez. This heavily staged operation, seemingly conducted as part of a deal brokered between the CIA and elements of the Venezuelan security establishment, grants the U.S. effective control over the largest oil reserves in the world. Enough fuel to sustain their domestic consumption and foreign wars for decades to come. Back on the home front, Trump has figured out a way to circumvent the prohibition against deploying federal troops for domestic policing. Not by invoking the Insurrection Act, as he's repeatedly threatened to do, but instead by transforming ICE into the 17th richest standing army in the world. With an annual operating budget of more than $27 billion. ICE has used this money to buy one of the most sophisticated domestic surveillance arsenals in human history, incorporating cutting-edge facial recognition software from Clearview AI, graphite phone hacking tools developed by the Israeli spies at Paragon, Flock Safety's automated license plate readers, and Palantir's AI-driven targeting and real-time tracking system, Immigration OS. Trump has wielded this jacked-up, tricked-out paramilitary snatch squad like a blunt instrument, terrorizing undocumented communities while attempting to bludgeon his political opponents into submission. In multiple U.S. cities, ICE deployments have been met with fierce and inspiring resistance. Unrepentant, the Trump administration has responded by doubling down on its use of force, while branding those bravely resisting in the streets as terrorists. In Minneapolis, the cold-blooded executions of Renee Good and Alex Preddy were followed by even more shameless character assassinations.
He was there to perpetuate violence.
The individual wanted to do maximum damage.
To kill law enforcement. It was an act of domestic terrorism. Domestic terrorism. Domestic terrorism.
These actions backfired, provoking levels of public anger that forced a rare tactical retreat and the sacrifice of two of Trump's lieutenants, CPB Commander Greg Bavino and DHS Secretary Kristi Noem. However, on March 13th, a Texas jury vindicated the state's clumsy efforts to brand Antifa as domestic terrorists, delivering a slate of guilty verdicts against the Prairieland defendants. 8 activists arrested following a noise demo at an ICE detention facility. The decision, a resounding victory for Trump's Department of Justice, sets the stage for future roundups of anarchists and other unapologetic enemies of American empire. There's no getting around it. These are dark times. Demoralization and disillusionment are spreading as we veer towards a terrifying future marked by war, crisis, and rising authoritarianism. So then, what do we do? There's no easy answer to that question. No singular political program or one-size-fits-all strategy is going to deliver us to a shiny, bright tomorrow. Each of us must find the path that is right for us. Be that as it may, here are some things to keep in mind when deciding which steps to take. First, we need to come to terms with the fact that nobody is coming to save us. No parties, no politicians, no judges, and no priests. Our individual and collective security, not to mention our liberation, rests solely on the decisions we make and the actions we take. At the same time, remember that you are not alone. Find your comrades, cultivate trust, develop affinity, learn new skills, and when you're ready, take action together. Resilience comes from strong communities and social movements built on overlapping and decentralized bonds. Strengthen those connections. Collectivize your resources and build your resiliency. Part of this means preparing for the reality of repression. Take security seriously. Challenge yourself to learn more about how the technology that you rely on works, and proactively seek out solutions and practices that will help keep you and your comrades safer. Consider what you would do if signal went down, the internet was blocked, and you weren't able to communicate via cell phone. Make plans for multiple contingencies. Build and strengthen organizations that support prisoners. Projects that can cut through state-imposed isolation and help demystify prisons so that they are understood not as a worst-case nightmare scenario, but as a brutal, albeit entirely possible consequence of effective resistance and a new terrain of struggle. Finally, build and nourish global networks of solidarity and mutual aid. Recognize that borders are just imaginary lines. Revolutionary internationalism is the answer to reactionary nationalism. Solidarity between social movements is the answer to wars between states. Keep in mind that it's much easier to establish connections before the outbreak of hostilities, before battle lines harden and effective communication becomes impossible. Foster those connections now. We have much to teach one another and many resources to share. What better time than now? The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born.